Hi everyone, I'm Stephen and welcome to Watch Out. In my last video I refurbished this Seiko. It is a 66-7100 and it's got a 66B movement inside of it. And you'll recall that it ended up being a bit of a basket case. I didn't get anywhere with it. So since then I've acquired these two watches. And so what my plan is eventually to end up with one nice watch out of the three. So firstly, I bought this one. They all came from the same place. You can guess where. I think this is actually a really cool looking watch. But one of the things that I noticed with it is that the dial itself is a bit mangled. You might not be able to see that on the camera. Certainly not clear on the photos from eBay. It's just the way things go with photographs. It's hard to tell. I actually thought the glass was damaged, but it's not the glass. It's actually the dial itself is damaged. So then I got this one here in the hope that the dial would be okay. Obviously the glass is damaged, but I believe that the dial is okay. This one looks really, really rough. It's got completely the wrong band on it. That's not right. I think the band on this one's really cool actually. I really like this. I've never seen anything like this, but it looks great. So that's my hope, and I may even end up replating. I think this is the best case, but I think either case would come up the best. They've got gold plated case. So the plan is to hopefully learn gold plating. So this is the nicest example of those three. And as you can see, apart from it running a bit slow, the plot actually looks pretty nice. This is the one with the wrong strap. And as you can see, it's kind of like all over the place. The amplitude is way too low. So that one is seriously sick. So that tells me that this one is the best out of the three. I think we're most likely to get some results out of that. So let's dive into this and see what we can do. So watchmaking tools can be pretty expensive, but I got these tools on AliExpress. This little yellow holding tool to hold the case, as you see, and then this unscrewing tool that will allow me to unscrew the back of the watch case. Okay, so that's got a 66A movement in it. The other one had a 66B. I have no idea what the difference is between the two movements, but I guess we'll find out eventually. So let's just have a look inside the other one. This is the beaten up one with the wrong band on it. That strap won't be going back on, or that band won't be going back on, so I'll get rid of that. That one came off fairly easily. This is a 66A as well. Anyway, this is the one that I want to rebuild, so let's just dive into this one. I need to undo these screws because there's this retaining ring that holds the movement. It spaces the movement out so that it correctly fits in a variety of movements, in a variety of cases. So we need to remove the winding stem so that we can get it out. And we also need to take this O-ring, which fortunately has not dried up and fallen into a million bits and pieces. So it looks like it's going to come out in one piece. Put that aside for now. Yeah, see what I mean about the dial? It's all really scratched up, and like the most obvious part was down here. Like, see, there's this gouge in it almost. and it's kind of like deformed down here, so I'm not sure what has happened there, but that dial is not redeemable. Okay, so now we need to get these hands off, and I always put this little poly Ziploc bag over the top of the dial, even though this dial won't be used. Just really good practice. It makes sure that I won't scratch the dial using the hand levers like so. And these were just cheap hand levers that I got. You can buy really expensive ones if you want to, but there's enough expensive tools to buy as it is. So if there's some cheap ones that'll do the job, why not use those? So those hands are off. And then I got my new cheap AliExpress plastic tipped tweezers. And then I've just got this little plastic membrane box to keep those in, keep them safe until I'm ready to use them again. So you recall I already slackened these off before. I just need to work out whether I've got to take one of them out all the way to get this ring off or not. Yeah, this one's loose now. Let's just see what's required to get this spacing ring out. Yeah, there it is, off. So I'll just put that screw back in so I know where it goes. And I'll tighten that one up as well, also so I don't lose it. Okay, so now we need to get the dial off. So we've got two dial screws that hold the feet on, and these are pretty small screws. People sometimes ask me, how do you know what screw goes where? But it's usually pretty obvious because they're usually different size. These ones are amongst the smallest sized. So there we go, we've got that dial off. And now we can start taking the movement apart. So that was the brass dial spacer and the hour wheel. They tend to fall off anyway, so I just take those out at the very beginning. And now I'm just letting the power out of the movement just by holding the ratchet back and just slowly ease it through my fingers. That lets all the power out of the watch, and now can take the balance off. Just one screw for the balance, gently ease it up like that, being very careful because this is the most delicate part of the entire watch. So easy to damage this very fine hairspring, which is what actually regulates the watch. It's what makes it keep time. So if you damage that hairspring, you're in big trouble. They can be repaired theoretically, but I've not done that yet, and I don't think I'd like to try just at the moment. So now removing the pallet fork bridge. This one is held on with just one screw. Sometimes they're held on with two screws. But this will allow us to remove the pallet fork itself. So just gently prise things up. In a watch like this that you don't know when the last time it was touched, oil can dry up, it can stick things together, so you really want to be careful and not force things, because otherwise you can damage them very easily. And these parts are especially fragile. So that's the pallet fork itself there. If there was power in the movement now, it would all be released in one giant explosion of power, and that would be really bad. So that's why we let the movement down before. So now removing the ratchet wheel. This is the part of the watch that actually gives you that really satisfying clicking sound when you wind the watch. It allows you to put power into the watch without it all being unwound back the other way. And this is the crown wheel, and you'll notice that this screw is reverse thread, and this one has got those 3 slots across the top of it to make it clear that it's reverse threaded, but a lot of the time they don't have. One of the things I've noticed with these Japanese movements is just the size of the slots just seems to be a little bit different. They just don't seem to work quite so nicely with my screwdriver set as opposed to the Swiss movements that I've moved on. So that's the ratchet wheel. This is the click spring. We don't want that to go flying away, so I hold that down with my plastic stick as I take the tension off it. Otherwise it will fly and I'll be on my hands and knees looking for it. And this is the click itself. That's the part that actually holds the power in place. So we take the crown wheel out as well. And now we've got this one bridge. Some movements have 2 separate bridges here, but we've got one bridge, so we'd call this the train wheel bridge because it holds all of those brass wheels that you can see in place. but it also holds the barrel in place in this single bridge. If we had a separate bridge, we'd call that the barrel bridge. So we just undo these screws. I am struggling a little bit with this in my technique still, because I'm looking down the microscope to do this, and it's very difficult to do this from top down. So I'm actually thinking about getting myself a head visor that would allow me to do this without looking straight down through the microscope, but you guys would still have the top down view with the microscope. Speaking of the microscope, I apologize. I actually realized that the record is not working on the microscope for this batch of footage, so I've only got 2 angles for this particular part of the teardown, but I think you guys pretty clearly can get the idea what's going on. So you might have noticed that I have a dust tray that I put all the parts into, and the tray has compartments. I tend to group the parts by function. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to put it back together. I probably don't need to do that at this point. I think I've got a pretty good idea what all the parts are for, but I think it just makes it easier, especially as you're getting started out, to group the parts together by function. So now with those 3 screws out, this train wheel bridge just lifts straight off. We have a little bit of a look underneath, just make sure nothing's got stuck to it, see what's going on. That doesn't look too bad. And so now we can access the actual train wheels themselves and start removing those. So this is the 4th wheel. It has a long extended pivot, which is what our 2nd hand was attached to. So this is our escape wheel. We can always tell it's the escape wheel because it has those very unusual shaped feet. They look a little bit like a boot. This is the 3rd wheel. And now the center wheel has its own little bridge because we had the 4th wheel sitting on top of it. So there's just a single screw holding this little bridge in place, and again we should just be able to gently prise this up, and we can see that the center wheel is sitting underneath it. So I just put that little bridge aside, and that's the barrel. That's where all the power to make the watch go is. The spring is inside that barrel, and now we turn the movement over to the other side. So we call this the motion work side or the dial side. Either term is fine because this is the side that the dial was on. And having removed everything that we could remove on the movement side, we get stuck into this. So it's quite common that there's a plate like this that just kind of holds things in place. So there's 2 screws that hold this on, and there are countersunk heads, and they are quite small, but they just won't go anywhere else. So again, it would become quite obvious that this is where they go. So we take that cover plate off. Now we can access the rest of the motion works. That's the minute wheel. Then we have this intermediate wheel that connects the keyless works to the motion works. Often there's a chamfer on that wheel on one side, and if there is, the chamfer would go down, but this one doesn't seem to have a chamfer. So now we can get stuck into removing the keyless works. I think this is a cool kind of little arrangement because there isn't actually a separate yoke spring. This arrangement has the spring and the yoke, which is like that lever under the bottom, kind of the 2 parts are stuck together. But the springiness is built into the lever itself, and that top plate just kind of holds it in place and connects things through to the setting lever. So I like that because it's one less spring to lose. Ask me why, I know. And then this is the setting lever itself. So off that comes. And now the winding stem will just come out because there's nothing holding it in place, and the last couple of parts of the keyless works, they'll just fall out or just come out like so. So we have a sliding clutch and the winding pinion. Now I've got this special tool which is called a cannon pinion removal tool, and we need to use this to remove the cannon pinion, which will be stuck there. It is stuck in there somewhere. This is the interface, if you will, between the timekeeping part of the movement and the time display part of the movement, which we call the motion works, and it needs to be able to slide. And that, with that off, now the center wheel just comes out. So we now need to disassemble the mainspring. As I said, this is where all the power to make the watch movement actually run is. So this top lid is just a force fit, so we just pop that off and just hold it down with a stick so it doesn't go flying. And then I just use my brass tweezers to sort of hold things in place, and then I use my stiff tweezers to remove the barrel arbor. So there's a little hook there, and I just twist this like so, and out the barrel arbor comes. So now we just need to try to get the mainspring out without it flying away, which I never seem to have very much success at. So let's see. No, that would be a no. Anyway, it's out. So now we need to get all of these parts cleaned, and so we just put them all into these little brass baskets, and I still tend to group them by function in the brass baskets because it just again makes it a little bit easier for me, but it's not really necessary. And the balance itself does not go in here, it's too fragile, and the pallet fork doesn't go in here either. Both of those parts actually have some jewels that are attached by shellac, and if I were to attempt to clean them using the cleaning fluid that I use, it would dissolve the shellac or soften it, and the jewels would fall off, so that would be really bad. So I clean those separately using a different material. And so we just put the mainspring in this big jar. So I'm using isopropyl alcohol, IPA. Seems to work pretty well for me. And then I just put the baskets into these little jars like so. And then I put them into my ultrasonic cleaner, fill it up with water as the medium to transmit the sound, and away we go. And as we get this cleaning, I'd just really like to encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you're enjoying my videos. Give me a thumbs up. Leave some comments, I love to read those. And also I've got a Patreon. You can really support my work and the channel by heading over to Patreon and becoming a member. So there's a bunch of jewels that actually need to be cleaned, and some people kind of do this at the end. It's pretty painful, which is the reason I guess why I'm doing it now, so I can get the pain over and done with before I dive into rebuilding the movement. And these springs that they tend to use in these Japanese movements are an absolute nightmare, I have found. I guess it's probably technique. They tend to go flying away just like that. And they're even harder to get back in. But anyway, that one's out, so I use a bit of Rodico just to pick up the jewel itself. And now I put it into this special cleaning material. It's called One Dip, especially for cleaning jewels and hairsprings. And then I just give this part of the jewel, so it's a two-part jewel, but part of it is set into the movement like so. So I just clean that using my stick, which has got some cleaning compound on it. And then the top part of the jewel we clean in the jar, and it needs to be absolutely spotlessly clean. Any dried up oil needs to be off there. Sometimes it needs to have a bit of a rub with the stick, as you saw. And now just the final clean with the Q-tip. And then this is the part I hate, is getting this little droplet of oil on here, which needs to be not too little but not too much, because the pivot for the wheel is going to be suspended in here. And this is the part that kills me every time, because I've got to get this turned over without the blob of oil touching anything. Ideally it should be done holding it in the wrist and turning the wrist, but that's really, really hard. A heap of practice, heap of fine muscle control required. So this is probably the absolute hardest thing that I have to do in working on any movement. And then we need that to stay in place while we get this retaining spring clip back into place. So if we bump the jewel in the wrong way, we can actually like dislodge the oil. And so really I think this should actually be done the other way around, in that those 2 feet go in first, but that's a whole lot easier said than done. It's just so small and so fiddly, and the thing is springy. You just look at it the wrong way and it just moves or it flies away. So it's an absolute nightmare. So anyway, I think we've just about have we got it? Yes, I think we have. I think this one is actually in place. Yep, it is. You can see all 3 parts are now clipped underneath that little ring, and so that jewel's not going to go anyway. So that's 1 jewel done. There's 1 more that needs to be done. This one is in the base plate itself. It's got the same clip arrangement. Remember this clip, I don't know why, but this clip is silver instead of just being brass. And then the bottom of the movement has got these kind of like ribbing on it, which actually makes it really difficult to work on because you don't actually have a flat surface. So anyway, I've got that spring out. Again, we need to do the same thing. Take this top jewel out, the bottom jewel's mounted into the movement itself. Put it in the 1 dip, clean it again, same way that we cleaned the other one. Make sure that it's spotlessly clean. Apply some oil to it. And now this is an example of how things can go wrong, because I've actually had all sorts of troubles that I've not shown you, and you get frustrated, you get tired, and that happens. The jewel just disappeared, never ever to be seen again. So I actually had to pinch a jewel out of the basket case movement, the 66B movement that I worked on in my last video. If I hadn't had that movement, it would be a real problem. So I think that's another reason too why when you're starting out, and I think I'm still starting out, it's good to have some scrap movements lying around. Only work on movements that you can afford to have scrap movements lying around. If you're working on a really rare movement where it's going to cost you hundreds of dollars to get spare parts, just don't do it, because you are going to lose parts in learning this hobby. So now we've got 1 more jewel in this base plate to take out, and this jewel is for the balance itself. So instead of having those single jewels with the bottom part of the jewel mounted in the movement, the entire assembly comes out, which I actually like much better because it's much easier to work on. So again, we take the thing out and the whole thing's come out. So there's 2 parts to that, top jewel and a bottom jewel. Again, put it into the 1 dip. Making sure that both parts go in. Give them a clean. Usually if they're stuck together, they'll come apart in the solution. So we clean the bottom part the same way as we did before. And once again, getting the top part of the jewel assembly out. If there's any dried on oil, we need to get rid of that, which we can do with our stick. And using the 1 dip, just make sure that it's absolutely spotlessly clean. Now we got to get our little dab of oil onto the jewel. I find that the stiff tweezers are the best to hold this. The thin ones, it's actually more likely to spring away. So these ones are less springy. Actually, that's probably a little bit too much oil, but it will suffice, I think. So this is why I prefer this, because I can get this jewel together into one piece like this. Now it's 1 part, so it doesn't matter if it rolls over. It's not going to ruin the oil inside of it. So it's much easier to handle and then to drop it into the movement like so. And now we've just got to get the spring back in place. And this one has a different spring design to what those other ones had. And I find this spring design is much less finicky, shall we say. You can see there's a little slot there that you drop it into. And so you kind of get one ear started, or even two of the ears started. And then you just rotate it around to sit it in place. So now we can start reassembling the movement. So firstly we put the center wheel into place. Then the mainspring barrel will go in. Now I actually had an absolute nightmare. Only one, you say? Yes. I had an absolute nightmare with the mainspring barrel, in that I broke the hook on the mainspring itself, and I wasn't able to source a replacement barrel, a replacement mainspring that was the correct size. So I ordered one from the UK that was shorter, and I thought that it would work, but unfortunately I couldn't get it to work. So what I ended up doing is I ended up using the entire mainspring barrel assembly from the basket case 66B that I worked on. You will recall, if you watched that video, it did have way too much oil in it, so I mopped out all the excess oil. Given I was having such an absolute nightmare, I didn't actually take the spring out of the barrel. I left it in there, but I did mop out the excess oil. So hopefully it should be okay. But yeah, absolute nightmare. I just couldn't locate the correct spring. So anyway, we've got that additional bridge in place, and this is not right, because that center wheel, it should be freer than that. So this is why it's so important to check your work as you're assembling the movement as best you can. You can't check everything, but things should be free, and if they're not, that's a problem. So all you can do is pull it apart and see what's going on. Otherwise, it'll just be assembling the movement for nothing. There has to be some reason why that wheel is not turning as freely as it should be. And there's not too many parts involved, as you can see. It just sits in this little recessed hole in the plate, and yeah, see how black it is? There's actually gunk in there. So this is a case of, it's been through the cleaner, but the ultrasonic cleaner is not magic. It's not going to do everything, and one should inspect all of the parts after cleaning, and I do, but I didn't really pay that much attention to this because it's just a plate, right? But yeah, there's this gunk. It's probably dried up oil, but there's this gunk in this little recessed hole, and that recessed hole is what sits over the top of the center wheel. And I'm guessing that this is actually what is stopping that wheel from turning freely. So I'm just using a small screwdriver just to persuade this gunk to come out. But we need to get this out of here. As I've said many times, my channel is all about giving you guys an honest assessment as to what's involved in this hobby. I think it's a fantastic hobby, but it would be so easy just to edit out all of this stuff so that you don't see it, and it just looks like I'm putting together a movement and never having any problems. I don't see what the point of doing that is. Yes, I still need to heavily edit things, otherwise the video would be like 6 hours long and no one would watch it. But I do want to give you guys an honest assessment as to the kinds of problems that I run into and just what's involved in this. So once we've got this hole spotlessly clean and are convinced that all of this gunk is out, just have a look at the wheel itself just to make sure that there's nothing obvious with the wheel, that it looks the way that it should, and I think it does. Then we can have another go. So we've got this bottom jewel here that the center wheel itself sits in. Bit of the medium viscosity oil for that. Set the wheel in place. And now we put this little bridge back on. Here's a little screw that secures it in place. That's better, I think. Put some oil in the top bearing. That feels, yeah, just as that oil works its way in, yeah, definitely that is a lot freer than it was before. So I think we've resolved that problem, the gunk in that hole. So now we can put our borrowed barrel assembly in place. And this is the escape wheel. It can actually be a lot harder than it looks, even just to get these pivots to sit into their jewel holes. Sometimes they can be quite recalcitrant, especially the third wheel, because you can't see anything. It's down that hole because we've got this plate here. And so it's just a case of fiddling and persistence until it actually does engage with the hole eventually, which it eventually did. And once that's done, we just hope that it stays there as we put the rest of the train wheel bridge in place. This tiny little washer, I almost forgot about this washer. You might remember this from the previous movement. This was actually stuck to the bottom of the fourth wheel, so I found it when I pulled it out of the cleaner, and is an example as to why one should probably pay fairly close attention to all of the parts as they are going into the cleaner or in preparation for cleaning. But it was okay in the end. I found the part. And so now let's see if we can get the train wheel bridge in place. As I said before, many people in their videos, they'll drop this on in one go, and it is possible to drop it in on one go. I think I'm getting better at this. What I have found in this particular one, it does vary a bit too from movement to movement, but I've got them all in place except for the escape wheel. And the escape wheel is the one that is most likely to kind of flop around. So what I tend to do is, rather than just fiddling around trying to get it absolutely perfect and drop it on in one go, I find it is easier just to grab hold of the wheel itself, and then through the microscope you can probably see that, just manipulate it until it actually engages with the hole. I'm just using my plastic stick to apply gentle downward force One, so that the bridge doesn't jump off, but just so that when it is in the right place, it will just sort of like snap down into place. Have we got it? Not yet. We're pretty close. I think that might be it. Yeah, that's it. You can actually just see the pivot poking through the end of the hole. And that actually wasn't too difficult. So we just make sure that everything is running freely just by physically turning the mainspring barrel, like so with tweezers. And so now we want to get some screws into this as quickly as we possibly can, because it's so easy to bump this and the bridge will jump off and then you have to start again. And we'll throw the screws away while we're at it. 3 screws. We'll throw that one away too. But yeah, I just like to get them kind of more or less in the holes or near the holes. So then once I apply myself to actually screwing them down, they are where I need them to be. So again, holding the bridge down with my plastic stick, we can just now manipulate these screws so that they are ready to be screwed down. Sometimes they can be a little bit tricky to get started. There we go. So you'll notice that I'm not screwing it all the way down. I just need to get the 3 of them started. Because let's say, for example, one of the pivots had jumped out, for example, or wasn't quite seated correctly, and I did screw it down all the way, then I could actually damage or bend the pivot, which would then probably mean I'd need to replace the entire wheel. So that's why I screw it partially down and make sure that everything is still free, and then tighten it down. So now we can start lubricating these wheels. So this is the 4th wheel, so I use the lightest oil on that one. So the 3rd wheel, we use the medium oil on the 3rd wheel. And the mainspring barrel itself, we use the medium oil on that. Usually there's 2 grades of oil that we use for most things, the light oil and the medium oil. Some movements have an oiling chart that tells you what oil to use where. I generally go by a rule of thumb that I've learnt from watching what other people do. Generally speaking, the fast moving things receive the lightest oil, so that's basically the 4th wheel and the escape wheel, and everything else that rotates receives the medium viscosity oil, and things that slide rather than rotate, they receive grease. And the pallet fork, because it doesn't actually rotate, it kind of rocks back and forth if you like, it doesn't receive any lubrication at all. General industry consensus is that that actually will add drag. So now we just put some of the medium viscosity oil on. This is where the crown wheel is going to go. And so we put the crown wheel in place, and you recall that this one was the one that was reverse thread. And so we'll just screw this one down. And as I mentioned, it's always a good idea to check one's work as one goes along. because this wheel is actually not rotating at all. So I think I did this once on another movement as well. I think I've got the wheel upside down. When I could have made notes for myself, I probably should have made some notes for myself for these kinds of things. It's good just to have a bit of paper next to you as to which way is up, or even some photographs or screenshots from the video in my case. But yeah, you can see I backed that off and it's now free, so clearly I've got the wheel upside down, so we got to do it again. Take the screw out. I found all these screws a little bit funny, like you undo them and then they'll just kind of like grab again at the very end of the thread, which is so frustrating because you can't get them out when they've grabbed again like that. Even though the screw is actually out and it's loose, it grabs and you can't pull the thing out. It happens to me quite frequently. Anyway, put the wheel in, make sure it's engaged with the teeth, and we put this screw back in. Again, reverse thread, and voila, it's free this time. So just nip it down. But yeah, that was the problem. It was upside down. Okay. So we just move to the click works now. So this is where the click lever itself is going to sit in that little hole. And then this blue stuff is grease. So this is generally what is used where things slide. I don't really like this arrangement at all because there's not really any bearing face or anything for this click lever. It just is going to sit here and it's going to slide across this surface. So it's not a problem as such because it's not actually in the movement train of the watch itself. But it means every time that lever moves back and forward, it's dragging across that surface and it's going to wear. I noticed in the last movement, the 66B, there was a huge amount of wear here where all the silver had been rubbed off and there was just brass showing underneath. So anyway, we need to get the click spring in place, which is actually a lot trickier than it looks because it's all flat and it just wants to jump away. If the slightest bit of upward angle or movement, it just jumps. So that's why I have the ratchet wheel close by here ready to go, that the second it looks like it's more or less in place, get the wheel on. Because the wheel is actually what is holding everything in place and stopping these parts from disappearing. But again, that also means that these parts will be rubbing on the bottom side of the ratchet wheel, which I'm not a big fan of either. Again, it won't affect the running of the watch, but I just don't like the idea of there being parts inherent to the design of the watch that are wearing. So we just get this screw nipped up now, and that will be hopefully the click works done. It all seems to be working correctly. I'll need to nip that up later on, but I just want to mop up this excess grease. Because excess grease, it tends to attract dirt and dust. The same for excess oil, it's not good. You want the correct amount of lubricant and no more, no less. Okay, so we're ready to put the cannon pinion back in place, and we need some grease here because the cannon pinion, it's almost kind of like a kind of a clutch, if you will. It needs to be able to independently rotate, but there needs to be enough friction there that it is actually moved by the movement itself. So it's kind of like having both worlds, if you will. But with my stiff tweezers, we push this place, we get that really solid click, and we need to make sure it's all the way down. Okay, so now we can begin assembling the keyless works. This is the winding pinion, which needs to be lubricated with our grease. And that just sits down in there. And then it interfaces with the sliding clutch. And so the sliding clutch itself also needs to have some lubrication as well. And then the winding stem itself, we lubricate that too. We're not trying to coat it in lubricant, we're just trying to apply some to opposite faces. And now we can put the winding stem in place, because otherwise the bits will fall out without it. Now, if you have an eagle eye, you will have noticed that there was actually a part in this hole which is part of the setting lever assembly, and that's this part here, and I actually forgot to take it out of the plate for cleaning, so I found it in the cleaning jar after it had been cleaned, so that's no problem at all. But it is a good idea just to keep track mentally in one's mind of what and where all the parts are, because otherwise it can be easy to lose things or forget things. So this is the setting lever itself, which just sits atop of that little post. And on that pointy bit at the top of the screen, there's kind of like a metal lug, and it engages with the actual winding stem itself. It's what allows you to change over between winding and hand setting modes. So we've got the yoke, and then this little cover plate goes on top to hold it all together, and just a single screw, and it's actually trickier than it looks to get everything just to sort of sit in the right place, and sometimes it can actually be quite tricky just even to get the screw to want to go into the right place. Now sometimes it's really quite unbelievable, I'll just almost leap into the hole, and then other times they want to be like this. And I think it might be because there's two parts sitting on top of the actual hole itself, and if they're not perfectly lined up, then the screw doesn't really want to go into the hole. So anyway, it's in there now, so let's get it started. Okay, so that's the yoke, it engages with that knot there. There we go. That's what's meant to happen. So we just nip that down now that we've verified it's functioning correctly. And there's some sliding parts, so sliding parts. We want to use our blue grease again. And this is where the yoke itself slides against the setting lever spring. Again, because we've got metal parts, metal rubbing against metal, we want lubrication there, otherwise they will wear. And we just clean out the excess with our Rodico. Okay, so this little hole here, this is an unusual arrangement I've seen in these Seikos. I haven't seen it anywhere else. But this is where the minute wheel sits, and instead of having a shaft for the minute wheel to sit on, the shaft is kind of like built into the minute wheel. But look at this. See that wearing on the wheel itself? I really don't like that at all. It seems to indicate to me that this movement has an inherent wear problem. And that 66B that I worked on, I think the fundamental problem with it, it was just worn out. The amount of wear that was in that movement was just quite unbelievable. Underneath this wheel, all the plating had been rubbed, literally rubbed off the main plate itself, and you can see the same thing is happening here. This movement's got a lot more life in it, hopefully, or it's experienced a lot less wear. But I just can't help feeling that there's an inherent design problem here in the motion works, and that it seems to be higher wear than is ideal. And wear is friction. Friction is things rubbing against one another in a way that they shouldn't be, and it absorbs energy. Energy is just so critical in the way that a watch operates. So if you are wasting energy, it's effectively like it's placing drag on the whole movement. It will want to slow the movement down. So one of the things I noticed about this particular movement is it had fairly low amplitude. And I think I can safely say that if you've got wear in the movement, or if you've got friction in the movement, then your amplitude will be down. Once the amplitude reduces to a certain point, the watch movement just can't operate reliably any longer. Anyway, we keep pressing on. So we've got to get this cover plate on. And this one's really quite tricky just to work out how it's supposed to be orientated. So I did have to go back and check the footage for when I disassembled this, just to know how to put it around. And we've got these screws which are pretty tiny. But the whole idea is to get this in place, and then things are much less likely to disappear. That's one done. That's two done. There we go, that's it. Okay, so that's the motion works done. Let's just test this. Well, I'm sure you guys are pretty smart, so you already noticed that I forgot to put a part in, so I feel a little bit silly, don't I? Because it is pretty obvious. The intermediate wheel is missing, and that, as I mentioned in the teardown, is the wheel that interfaces the keyless works to the motion works. And so without it, obviously, nothing is going to happen. So I just loosened off both screws, and I took one screw out just to allow me to move this cover plate out of the way so that I can get the intermediate wheel onto its post. And it's a rotating part, so we want some of our medium viscosity oil on this post. As I mentioned, this is the kind of post I would have expected there to be for the minute wheel. Every other movement that I've ever worked on apart from these Seikos has that, but not these Seikos. Now I'm just double checking whether there's a chamfer. I can't see a chamfer. So I believe this part is symmetrical both sides, in which case it won't matter which way it goes. Put it on the post, get it engaged with the teeth. And now we just need to put this cover plate back in place. So theoretically this should work now. And it does, yep. There you can see the intermediate wheel spinning, connected through to the motion works. That's what's supposed to happen. So we can now continue with putting the movement together. We've got to put the pallet fork in place, and it's got to go the right way up. The way that you tell which is the right way up is on the end there's kind of like these two forks that stick out either side, and in the center there's like a horn that's always on the bottom, because the impulse jewel is going to sit in that little cradle, if you will, and if the horn's on the top or if it's upside down, then it can't sit in there. So that's the way you know which way up the pallet fork goes. And so we get the bottom pivot sitting into the jewel, and it is going to tend to flop around. We get this bridge more or less in place and get the screw in place. Again, you can see that this screw, it's different to all the other screws. So we get this screw started. And I did actually make sure that it was aligned properly before I screwed that down. Because again, you could, if you didn't, you could easily damage the pivot or even break it off, which would be pretty catastrophic. So now we want to put some wind into the movement, which we can do because the pallet fork, it's holding the wind in there. If the pallet fork wasn't there, it would just unwind itself. And you see, as we push it, it should snap back and forth, and it does. So now we've got this special grease that is used to lubricate the teeth of the escape wheel, because they are sliding across the face of that jewel that you can see, and there's another one that you can just see on the inside of the fourth wheel, is that wheel that you're looking at. So what we do is we apply a blob of grease to the end of the exit stone, and then we advance 5 teeth. Then we do it again. Apply the grease to the face of the exit stone, and we advance 5 teeth. And just because the way I'm doing it, I'm not being quite as precise as I should. I think I'm getting 6 teeth there, but that doesn't matter. And now the last time, blob of oil. A lot of people don't show this in their videos because, as you can see, it's quite difficult to film doing this through the microscope. And it is very fiddly. So we do that there. And you can see we've kind of like got a blob of grease sitting on top of the jewel. So I just want to mop that up. Some people, what they actually do is they take the pallet fork out and clean it. But I don't think that really needs to be done, because you can see that's cleaned up quite nicely just with the Rodico. So now, this is real moment of truth stuff, because the movement is just about together. There's very few parts left, as you can see, but here's the most important one. The balance, literally the heartbeat of the watch. This is the equivalent to the pendulum in a grandfather clock. It's exactly the same kind of a principle. Back and forth. So what we need to do is get the wheel, it needs to sit underneath the fourth wheel, like so. Then we've got to get the pivot sitting in its hole, and then we want to rotate it like so, so that it engages with that little cradle that and look at that. It just kicked up straight away. That doesn't always happen, or not to me anyway. That was first go. and that is really encouraging. So you would have seen as it rotated, it just engaged with that little cradle, and there was enough energy there to actually just start the watch, and away it went. So with everything sitting in place correctly, we can just put this screw in place. Again, sometimes that can just be a little bit tricky to get started, but there we go. And that is really encouraging. Okay, so we've got one last jewel that we need to clean now, which is exactly the same as its mate, which was on the opposite end. So yeah, this jewel is for the balance, and we clean it exactly the same way that we cleaned. Firstly, by throwing the spring away and finding it, using Rodico, which is kind of like watchmaker's blue tack, but it's fantastic stuff, and it's really useful for all sorts of household tasks that have got nothing to do with watchmaking. So into the one dip, give it a clean in the one dip, and it did separate in there. So now we've got to find the jewel. There it is. Sometimes it can be really quite tricky to find it in the bottom of this jar. And so we clean the bottom part of the jewel, again using the stick, just the same way as we did before. Make sure that that's nice and clean. Looks pretty good. And now we need to clean the top jewel, again the same way that we cleaned all the other ones. And once we are certain that it is spotlessly clean, we can again hold it in place with my stiff tweezers and apply this drop of oil. That's not enough oil. That's probably a little bit too much, but it will be okay. So now again, because I'm doing this all under the microscope, I need to get the bottom part of the jewel close so I can see what's going on, and then drop it on top like that, keeping our blob of oil intact. And so now it's one piece again, and being one piece, we've got to get it into place in the top of the balance assembly. And once it's in place, we put our spring back in. There we go. So after some regulation, you can see that this is actually looking pretty good. It's keeping time quite well. The beat error is fine. The amplitude is lower than I would like it to be. It has improved slightly on what it was at the very beginning, but that amplitude is fairly low. I suspect it may have something to do with this being a high wearing movement. So we need to deal with the dial. This is the original dial, really beaten up. And this is the dial I pulled out of the other movement. It looks almost brand new. It looks fantastic. So I'm definitely going to use that dial. So the final part of the assembly is the last of the motion work. So this is the hour wheel, just a little bit of lubrication. And we put the wheel in place. Make sure it engages with the teeth. Sometimes it wants to be a bit recalcitrant. And then we've got to put this dial washer. And it goes in there like that. So now we can put the dial in place, which actually it can be a little bit tricky to get in place. So it ended up happening not in front of a camera. We need to do up these dial screws. Now I've been rather naughty here, and then I should have been wearing finger cots, so I've managed to put fingerprint grease on the dial, so I just cleaned that up with some Rodico, but I really should have been wearing finger cots there, and I know I need to get in a better habit of wearing finger cots. There's no need to tell me. I'm also changing the hands because these hands came off the other movement and these are like brand new. There was nothing wrong with the ones that I took out of this movement, but these ones, they really do look like they are brand new, whereas the other ones a bit scratched up. So these will look really fantastic on this dial, which also looks brand new. So we just put the hands in place, just push them in place with my little hand press tool, and now we put the second hand in place. Just give a little bit of a push to get it engaged. Come on, it's so easy for it just to flop off and end up upside down. And now just a bit of a push with the hand tool, like so. Okay, that's looking pretty good, and look how gorgeous that dial looks. We just make sure that the hands rotate around without fouling on anything. Sometimes they might have a little bit of a bend or something in them, or just something's not quite straight, so there might be a position where they'll actually foul against one another, which will stop the watch. So we just need to make sure that they are free. And so now we can actually move towards recasing this movement, which is really, really exciting. So we've got to get this spacing ring back in place. It's got those two screws that hold it in place. And once it's in place, we can just do these two screws up again. And that one as well. I've got to say, I just don't think the quality of the Seiko movements is quite up there with the Swiss ones. I've only really worked on a couple of FHF or ST movements, which were certainly the lower end of the Swiss market, but I've got to say that as a design, I just think that those just seem to work better than these Seikos. I know it's a very broad generalization. There's some Seikos out there that are quite collectible, quite popular. Maybe this is part of the reason why there isn't much on YouTube about these 66As, 66Bs. Maybe they're inherently prone to the kinds of problems that I've seen in this movement. I just don't know. Maybe people who know more than me will say so down in the comments. So I think it's a really cool looking watch, but in terms of its quality, I've got some serious question marks. So I was sort of like intending to go a bit down the Seiko path, but I've got to say this movement I think has really put me off. But it's still a good learning exercise, and I think I probably will do I'll do a case restoration, because I would rather learn how to do a case restoration on something like this than on my Omega, for example, which also needs a case restoration. These were cheap, but they're basically sacrificial. I've got 3 cases. I've got 2 of these gold-plated ones, so nothing to lose really in learning how to do the case restorations on that. So that'll be a separate project. But anyway, let's just get this thing back together. I'm reusing the O-ring that was in it. I have got a brand new one, but I'll keep that for when I actually do that case restoration. I've actually got a glass as well, but the glass in this one is actually pretty good, but I'll decide on what I do when I do the case restoration. So we just need to get this O-ring fully in. Okay, we'll use the flat end like so. Is that going to sit in? Yeah, I think that's in. Okay, so now we can get the back on. Isn't this exciting? Screw that on. And I think we are actually done. Look at that. Look at how that's come up. Look at that on the wrist. It looks wonderful. and this is the case if that gorgeous dial was in. Anyway, thank you so much for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really look forward to seeing you on the next one, and don't forget to watch out.